Hi there, everyone. Thank you for joining us to today's Education in Motion webinar, Rigid Wheelchairs Fit and Function, Perceptions of Riders and Therapists. Happy to be joined today by a variety of folks here, and I'm going to turn it over to Jessica to sort of introduce everyone and bring everyone on board. We'll be taking any questions at the end of the webinar, so if you have any questions that pop up during the presentation, feel free to type those into the chat or into the questions function, and we'll see those and get to them at the end. Jessica?
Hi, I'm Jessica. I'm an occupational therapist, and I'm part of the education team here at Sunrise Medical. And I'm very excited that we have this panel of experts to talk about rigid wheelchairs. Mary Shea is an occupational therapist at Kessler Rehab Hospital. Cindy Smith is a PT, and she recently retired from Craig Hospital, but she's still involved in the industry on a contractual basis, and I grabbed her for this panel. Josh Anderson is the VP of Business Development here at Sunrise Medical. Jim Black is our Director of Strategic Accounts and Business Development. And Sarah Leonard is our Regional Educator Manager in the Northeast. And so I want to get started by asking some questions. And the questions are not in order of how you would prescribe a rigid wheelchair. Every one of the topics that we're going to talk about relates to each other when it comes to configuring a rigid wheelchair. So we want to let you feel free to leave your comments, questions, and perceptions in the question and chat boxes, and Marquette will address those. We'll bring those up at the end, and then we'll all be able to address those. We do want to hear from you. We're only going to spend a maximum of about 10 minutes on each topic so that we get as many topics to talk about as we can. So first, Cindy, how do you determine seat width?
You know, Jess, I was thinking about this question the other day, and I was looking back thinking about when I graduated or when I was in PT school, and a little bit we learned about wheelchairs. But the big thing we learned about wheelchairs was that you were supposed to measure the person's body width and then add 2 inches. And it's funny because I very quickly, as I started measuring wheelchairs, realized that wasn't a very good plan, because when you measure 2 inches, it's kind of like a house. When you get a bigger house, you very quickly accommodate to that house and fill it. And people fill their wheelchairs, right? They'll fill it in a variety of reasons. And normally, if you make the wheelchair too wide, they're going to sit sideways in the wheelchair just to fill it up and give themselves stability. So that's not really a good plan to do that. But the funny thing is I got looking on the internet, just Googling to see what it said out there in the internet world of how do you measure, and that's still what they tell you to do, which I find really interesting. So in all reality, the way I look at it is several things. The first is, what's the width of the person? And you have to, it's really good to get out, if you can, to get out a caliper. If you don't have a caliper, sit them on a mat table or something, and you measure the actual troch to troch, trochanter to trochanter width of the person. And you're measuring outside of the hip to outside of the hip. The problem with that is if you get somebody who's got a lot of redundant tissue, then what happens is that you've got a lot of redundant tissue filling the chair, and their body's still going to slosh side to side in the chair. So if you can squish that in a little bit where it's comfortable bringing your hands into, and then measure that width. If you've got them on a table and you don't have a caliper, then you can just put your hands there and have somebody measure your 2 hands, or you can find a way to mark your 2 hands and actually measure that. The other thing you have to really think about not only is the width of the person. If the chair's too wide, they're going to have lack of stability and they're going to move side to side in the chair. If the chair's too narrow and they have bony trochanters, you potentially will cause them skin problems on their trochanters, which is very, very hard to heal. So you need to pay attention to both of those. And the other thing you need to pay attention to is postural deformities. So if they have fixed postural deformities, you're not going to be able to correct them. You've also got to accommodate for the width of those postural deformities. If you can correct them, it's a better idea to do that. And one of the things, I was very lucky as a therapist at Craig Hospital because we have a lot of wheelchairs. So the best idea is, if you can, to actually get a person in a wheelchair that you're thinking about ordering, the width you're thinking about ordering, and make sure it truly fits them. Because again, on paper, things can look good and maybe not look really good when you actually try it out. So those are the big things I need to think about with the person themselves. The other thing, if they have postural deformities, and if you're considering putting them in a custom seating system of some sort, you also want to make sure that you've accommodated for the width of that custom seating system. The other reason you don't want the chair too wide is because the wider the wheelchair is, the further the arms are spread to access the wheels and propel the wheelchair. And that's a really big issue, because the wider the arms are, the more stress it puts on the shoulders, the more strain. And so you don't want the wheelchair to be too wide for them. It also will decrease their accessibility into their environment, because the wheels sit outside of the wheelchair seat. And the wider that is, the more difficulty they're going to have getting through narrow doorways and around corners that make it more difficult to maneuver. The other thing you need to remember is that manufacturers are very specific in the way that they measure the width of the wheelchair. And in this case, with this picture right here, the width of the wheelchair is the width of the outside seat frame to the outside seat frame. In some manufacturers, that will also be the width of the back, right? So it would be from outside back frame to outside back frame, but not with every manufacturer. So you need to make sure that you're really following the manufacturer's order form and looking at any of the little asterisk footnotes that they have and following those. Done with this picture, Marquette. Thank you.
Josh, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think Cindy touched on it, and it's very important to just make sure that you are looking at what the manufacturer is calling out for that measurement. I've seen where they measure from side guard to side guard. I've seen where they measure from backrest to backrest, and I've seen where they do it from outside of seat rail to outside of seat rail. So, and all of those things have a slight variation to them. So, when we're talking about a manual chair, the ability to fine tune that's really important. So it's not that you're going to be very far off, but you want to be as close as possible to that measurement, because as Cindy also stated, it affects your ability to access the rear wheel, and certainly is one of the factors in affecting your ability to access the rear wheel.
Mary, how about you? Anything?
No, I think she nailed it. I mean, you got it. Every consideration. Well done.
All right. Jim, what is seat slope when we're talking about dump and squeeze, and how do you determine it? And what's the importance of seat slope?
Hey guys, and Cindy, great job. You hit every point that there was on the width, but when pertaining to seat slope is really the angle of the seat. And it's generally or typically, the rear seat height is lower than the front seat height. So that differential that we have. And sometimes seat slope is referred to as seat squeeze or seat dump, but those terms are used very loosely out in the field. So they can be the meaning could be kind of misunderstood. So as a profession, I think what we're looking at, and particularly on the manufacturing side, when our engineers are looking at product, they're looking at what the slope is, and typically on a chair that an able-bodied person sits on, it's like 5 to 10 degrees is kind of that sweet spot. But we typically measure seat slope by inches or by measurement, millimeters or wherever that's going to be. So trying to really understand what that is. So if you have a differentiator between the front seat height and the rear seat height, you're looking at like a 1-inch seat slope or a 2-inch seat slope or a 3-inch seat slope. And that's typically how we measure that in the field. And you can get very detailed when you look at that rear seat height. But the trends are changing today. Back when I started in this industry many years ago, it was 2, maybe 3 inches at the most, and it went to 4 inches, and now you're starting to see the seat slope trends changing a bit. Where the importance of seat slope is, or why we do seat slope, it's really to give better wheel access. But ideally, what you're trying to do is get a lower center of mass, a lower center of gravity to create that stability and balance. That's a critical point to creating seat slope. And one of the new terms that we're hearing today, and one of the big things to be successful in a wheelchair fit is really understanding weight distribution and what you're doing. Because the importance of seat slope, by creating better balance or a lower center mass, you're also creating better contact area. And that's why we can get into ergo seats and different types of seating and things like that. But that connection between that backrest and that seat is very critical for the balance of the user, of the rider. So I know that's a long definition, but seat slope is that variation between what that slope is, posterior or anterior to the seat.
And therapists, what do you feel is the importance of having a seat slope or a dump?
Well, I think Jim pretty much covered it in terms of giving people like that access to the rear wheel. And so when you look at some of the guidelines that are out there, if we look at the clinical practice guidelines and what we've been trying to, measure it to find that ideal spot for each person, the clinical practice guidelines talks about if you think about the wheel as a clock, the top of the clock is 12 o'clock. And if someone is sitting upright with their great balance and alignment, so we figured all the other things out with their back angle, etc., then when they put their hand on the top of the wheel, if you measure the elbow angle, it's 120 degrees would be average. So anything from 100 to 120 degrees is approaching that sweet spot for people. So you maximize their wheel access, which is what Jim is referring to. And so that's the clinical practice guidelines, just how it's just influencing it. And if you look at like some of the literature, it goes back as far as Brubaker, like 1980s, 1986, I think, talking about this. And that, of course, we should be configuring this for people. And so in terms of language, exactly like Jim said, we use so many terms sometimes to define the same concept. And there's been a lot of push in the industry to minimize that. And so the latest and greatest with seat slope is back with Michelle Lang's work, and it's posterior seat slope, just so that's supposedly the most current nomenclature to use. And so I'm always trying to watch that nomenclature because, if you watch anything that any of us write, you see sometimes it's squeeze, sometimes it's dump, and it's posterior seat slope. It's the same concept. So we as an industry are still working on getting there, but essentially that's the latest and greatest in terms of what I understand with the nomenclature. And so I think it's all about giving people the wheel access, and that's huge from a height perspective. A down and dirty way to do it, which is how I do it in the clinic most of the time because I'm not pulling out the goniometer every time, is that I'm looking at when somebody is sitting upright in the chair, and again, the back angle's all accounted for here, etc. And when they're as upright and balanced as possible and they drop their hands straight down, we're hoping that the middle finger, that last part of the middle finger is right over the axle of the wheel. So that's a down and dirty way to say, hey, that's, we're approaching that ideal rear seat height from the person for that person. Then of course the front seat height depends on wheel the height of their legs, et cetera, and, what can they transfer out of and how much stability do they need, et cetera. It was a little more than 2 cents, sorry.
So I think that was very well said. I think Jim also touched on a couple of things that I just wanted to reiterate on. First, I think I cringe every time I hear the term seat dump. I think it's probably the worst term that we have in our industry. I love seat slope, and Jim touched on it, and I think this is really important because I think this panel tends to, because they've done this so much, we tend to look at somebody in the chair and we're switching from degrees to inches really quickly. So like Mary said, I never pull out a goniometer. I'm looking at the front and the rear seat height. But as Jim pointed out, it really is between 5 and 10 degrees. And the reason that's important as a degree is because if you have a shorter seat depth, that 1 or 2 inches becomes a greater degree between the front and the rear seat height. So I just wanted to point that out as the reason we tend to refer to 5 to 10 degrees is if you have a seat depth, the average seat depth is about 16 inches. My experience in the last 20 years of looking at all the orders that come through the manufacturers I've worked for, 16 is the most common seat depth. And typically you're doing about an 8-degree differential between your front and your rear seat height at 16 inches. So, but we tend to look at it as professionals as what is that differential in inches. And we're making that calculation real quick just based on our experience. So if those out there ever feel like they're doubting themselves, you can pull out a goniometer or an angle finder on your smartphone and check to see if you're between that 5 and 10 degrees. And again, you don't need to be either. As a quad, I tend to have a little bit more seat slope. I also tend to use an ergo seat like Jim talked about so that I can keep my pelvis from rotating any further forward. I sacral sit, just, 30 years in a chair and my level of injury, I sacral sit, but I use that ergo to keep that from migrating further forward. And I use the slope of the seat also to control my pelvis so that I feel stable in the chair and I can move around as freely as possible.
That was what I was just going to say is I think that's the seat slope. I think that's a good baseline to go through, that 5 to 10 degrees. But again, I think that really depends upon the individual. If you've got somebody who doesn't do very good transfers, they're having to, we call it dig out of that seat slope, and it's very hard, especially when they have cushions that may have slope in them as well. So I think that's one thing you need to consider. I think another thing to consider is, I've gone anywhere from a very flat seat to, and Jim, I think Jim helped me build a wheelchair way back when, for a person that I actually put 7 inches of difference between the front and the back seat with a 16-inch deep seat because he was so severely anteriorly rotated. And we needed to roll his pelvis back into a more neutral position. And that was the only way we could do it. And so that was, I think for him, again, it's the looking at the individual. The other thing I think with wheel access and this is something I learned working in outpatient spinal cord injury and seeing people year after year after year is not everybody has really long arms like Josh does. Josh is great. He can sit way down and have great wheel access and still be able to reach his environment. But most people who are sitting in wheelchairs, they're living in a stand-up world where everything is above their heads. And if they have really, really short arms, it's going to be hard for them to do everything in their environment. So you have to look at that person and say, which is more important for them?
That's a critical key, Cindy. Sorry, Sarah. Center mass, really understanding that center of gravity and that seat slope to get you as deep or lower to the ground always creates, but then there's problems. So trying to figure out if we always start with the front seat height because the rear seat height to me seems pretty easy to determine. Not easy, that's the wrong word, but it's really hard. It's not the angle. It's really trying to figure out what that front seat height is and then what that slope is going to be, because you can only go so low. So that's where it takes some mastering, which you guys see every day in your clinics. Sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
No worries. No, I was going to say, just from a trend standpoint, as a newer clinician, I've gotten the feedback of, why did you script my first chair this way? I'm looking for this now. And one of the things that Cindy mentioned was a lot of times we do take into consideration that transfer and how difficult it's going to be for a user to get to the edge of their cushion, complete the transfer independently. But I do see over time, specifically when the rider's coming for their second chair, them saying, I do want to sit a little bit lower, deeper to my wheels. I'm wanting more of that stability so that I can make my frame a little tighter, tighter footprint, more maneuverable, that type of thing. So just comparing and contrasting where they may start on an inpatient level with a newer clinician, but also, where they come to seeking out Josh and Jim's help to get something that's a little bit more fine-tuned, we'll say.
Thanks, everyone. That was great. So, Mary, the center of gravity is a common consideration when we're designing a rigid wheelchair. Can you give us your perception of center of gravity and how you determine the axle placement for new and seasoned riders?
Sure. So if we pull up the picture just to explain to everybody, there we go, so what is center of gravity? So we already spoke about the height of the rear seat, okay? And so that's depending on the type of chair that we have. Can be determined by the height of the axle or sometimes by the height of the seat by itself. And so if it's axle plate technology, sometimes you're doing it through the axle and then you're getting that rear seat height off of that. But if it's axle tube technology, you may be doing it slightly different. And so then you just measure that rear seat height. So then once you have that dialed in for the height, what we're looking for is that center of mass, that front to back stability, so anterior, posterior stability. So what is that giving to somebody? It's helping to balance the chair. And so why do we want to adjust center of gravity? I think the major reason to optimize somebody's center of gravity is because the minute you make changes in that, it helps to change their rolling resistance, how much effort they're actually pushing. And so our goal is to always maximize their efficiency with the least amount of force and strain on their arms. So if we look at those upper limb guidelines, we're decreasing the force. We're also decreasing the repetitiveness of the push on the hand rim and typically moving the center of gravity more forward, which is considered a unstable position. So the clinical practice guidelines talks about as forward as possible. So what is that? Okay. And so it's the center of gravity is the anterior posterior position of the rear wheel. And we want to do that when the person's body weight's in the chair to help optimize it to their body. And of course, all the measurements we spoke about already with the width is already considered, and we already hopefully figured out that the rear seat height. So now the next thing is the forward back. So something to think about with the forward back before we start adjusting the center of gravity is that person and their posture stable? So we want to make sure we have dialed in the back support angle at that point so that the person has their typical balance, because that back support angle is going to influence their amount of weight that's behind the axle at the rear of the chair. And so you want to make sure you have a good idea what that is. And so the way I measure it happens to be the way that Ty Light measures it. And so I hate to use a manufacturer name, but they're more specific in terms of, okay, looking at center of gravity, and this is how you would measure it. So it was from the front edge of the back tube to the middle of the axle. And so you measure that in terms of inches. And so you would say, okay, I want a 2.5, I want a 3, I want a 3.5 inch, whatever, center of gravity, okay? And that helps to set the rear wheel closer to the person's center of mass. So when we're looking at that, what is their center of mass? And so our goal, ideally, when we're looking at that forward back adjustment, is to put about 80% of their body weight over the rear wheel. So we minimize the amount of force coming through the front and the weight coming through the front casters in the front part of the chair. So typically, it's 80% over the rear, 20% over the front. And so this way, and you're somewhere approaching there to maximize somebody's weight distribution on the base. And of course, like Cindy had mentioned earlier with the body type, we have to consider somebody's body type with this. And so of course we need to acknowledge people who have longer torsos and shorter extremities because they're taller. And so the lever arm up there, they could be more tippy posteriorly, versus somebody who's shorter with has a shorter torso with longer extremities. Also, the other thing we want to think about is what type of body do they have? Is their body weight pretty much evenly distributed throughout their frame? Or do they have a really developed upper body relative to their lower body and there's going to be a lot more weight up where their shoulders are? Or what's happening with their abdominal tissue? Is there a lot of abdominal tissue there because they have an apple-shaped type body? And so you just need to really try to balance that as well. So you want to consider all of that as you're setting up that center of gravity. The rule of thumb is 80% again of their body weight over the rear wheel. And for people who are experienced users, a lot of times I'll look and see what they're working with in their current chair. And then I have the luxury, similar to Cindy, of having demo chairs. So if we're changing manufacturers, I'd like make sure that somebody's set up in the chair that we're looking to specify. And then I would do that measurement there. And I would start with, depending on where they're at, something close to that. And then decide if we're changing posture or something, we do a little tweak forward or back accordingly. Now, if somebody's a newer user, what do you do, right? Because probably, especially when people leave rehab these days, they certainly don't have the wheelchair mobility skills. All of this is new. They're learning how to work with their body. And they're also not, we can't really figure out where their postural stability is and their balance. They're still learning some of that. And so a lot of times we try to set it up approaching that ideal space in terms of the 80% of weight over the rear wheel, but maybe not all the way there yet. And then the number one thing to also consider at that point is to make sure that that you order anti-tippers for that chair. So it'll give them a chance to develop the wheelchair mobility skills. And as they go through their rehab, hopefully they're learning that. And then eventually we would get to taking off the anti-tippers. And once they show proficiency, you may even be moving that center of gravity a little more forward. So that's a little bit with new versus experienced users. And the other things to just consider when we're thinking about the person's body in the chair, and the weight of everything, not to forget what they typically move around with, because people carry things. We tell them they shouldn't be carrying that heavy backpack with them, etc. But some people do all the time, and that's just who they are. That's the woman who's walking around with the huge purse, and so whatever it is, you have to just make sure that we're accounting for what that person's typical lifestyle is and what they usually have on the chair. If they usually have sometimes a young child on their lap as they're moving from point A to point B, we want to account for that front weight a little bit, etc. And so that's something to consider just in terms of what other people carry on the chairs besides their body. And one last thing that's really important, I think, when we look at center of gravity is also to consider ADL performance. Because if people are in public spaces for toileting and they need to maneuver their pants down over their buttocks, then for that, they most likely will be doing that from the chair. And so, of course, we'll be teaching them to sit toward the front of the chair, etc. But sometimes we may have to make small little compromises in center of gravity for that to make sure they can fully get their pant up and down over their buttocks. So I think that pretty much are the major considerations as we're looking at center of gravity and that forward back position of the axle. And again, the major goal of that is just for propulsion efficiency, to minimize the amount of effort people use when they're mobilizing themselves in their lives.
Thanks. Jim, Josh?
That was well said. She hit almost every point. And it's really critical to really understand that 80-20 rule is a rule of thumb, as Mary was talking about. But there are other tricks of the trade, too, to really try to offload the front of the casters. But I think anti-tips, Mary, you're 100% right. You might as well start more forward and use anti-tips to create that. It takes you a while to acclimate to kind of any new mobility device. So to really test that and test those theories out in your clinic setting are highly important, using demos and using those things to really optimize where that is, because the rolling resistance that are created with a wheel too far back, or the wheel axis affects seating, affects everything. It affects it all. So it's a really important way to try to find where that center mass is and really try to optimize where that axle is early as possible.
I would add, and I think Mary brought it up, and it's a great point, is the anti-tippers, especially for a new rider. And the reason I feel in this case that it's so important is that in my experience, this is the number one thing that people try to do the right thing for their client and do the wrong thing. And what I mean by that is that, and Cindy, I think, talked about this in hers, where, if you give somebody a little bit extra room, people are adaptable and they're going to conform to the chair, right? So if we don't get them set up with the proper weight distribution right from the get-go, they're going to get used to using the chair the wrong way. So that 70 to 80% of the weight over the rear wheels is critical. 70 is bare minimum. 80 is where we want to be. If we can get that new rider set up that way, give them anti-tippers so that they feel safe, as Mary talked about with the preservation of upper limb function, push the rear, and they stay in there, push the rear wheels as far forward as possible without making the rider feel uncomfortable. If we can do that, then we are benefiting every single push stroke that they have, because we're reducing the weight on the front wheels. So the chair maneuvers faster, it rolls better, right? And I see it all the time, where what we think we're doing is we're setting up the chair so that they feel stable and they don't feel like they're going to flip over backwards. Well, that's 2,500 to 3,000 times per day that the average manual rider pushes. Every single time you're penalizing them. So if we can get that weight distribution set up correctly and use the anti-tippers so they feel safe, they're going to feel a lot more comfortable in the chair. They're going to have a lot more mobility. I know firsthand when my weight distribution is not correct, and center of gravity is part of that, then if I'm rolling over uneven surfaces, the chair wants to pull towards the lower side of the road, right? Mm-hmm. So it affects everything that you do every day.
So I think that's so important, because like Mary said, and Cindy, everybody's nodding. And I think that those of us who have seen individuals come back or see them on the street, one of the biggest things that bothers all of us is that the wheel's not in the right place. And you can see by their propulsion, you can see by how they're balanced, that they may have been placed in that upon discharge or when they got their new chair, and now it's months later, years later, and their wheel is still in the same position because it hasn't been brought to the right place. So I appreciate Mary saying, give them anti-tippers, bring them up a little bit more than you think that you would because you wanted to give them more stability. And Josh, I appreciate as a writer and Jim saying, yeah, we want to really work on that, because I do think that that's one of the biggest things that I see happening when I see individuals and their wheels are just way too far back.
I think too, from a clinician standpoint, when you go into a clinic, you'll hear a lot of clinicians say, acknowledge the 80-20. They'll acknowledge, the RESNA paper of bringing the wheels this far forward. But they'll say, oh yeah, no, I gave him center of gravity. I gave him 2 inches. So the perception is that, 2 inches is fairly aggressive, and then 2 inches, put those tip bars on because, it might be a little tippy. So just to address a little bit of the elephant in the room and give maybe Josh and Jim, Mary, a platform to say, what is that? Is there a number of that center of gravity that you're starting at? How comfortable are you kind of moving with that, even with a new user, to trial it before prescribing a chair?
And I wanted to just add 2 things. One is that I remember it, like we're talking about all the decreased rolling resistance for going forward, but it also facilitates turning. It's a whole different chair to turn. If you look at, I know there's a study out there and I just couldn't remember who did it, but all you have to do with a client is change the center of gravity on the chair, and they'll feel like they're in a new chair. They're like, it's so much lighter. And you're like, wow, nothing else is different, but that just tells you what a difference it makes. And the other thing is Jan Furamatsu just did an amazing study, and I know I went to something that she presented.
The ISS.
It was ISS, and it talked about a 40% reduction in shoulder load when you set up the center of gravity more, and among other things, more ideally. I mean, that's huge for our clients just to take note of that. So I just wanted to, point that out as well. We're finally seeing some research to help support some of our decisions. But the last thing I wanted to add is when we do these things, of course, it makes people uncomfortable and nervous. But of course, we're trying them in the clinic with the client. Make sure you go up that hill and make sure they're leaning forward when they go up a hill, and they know some of those basic techniques so that, of course, there's not too much weight on the back and they're not tipping backwards. The other is also when they're leaning all the way forward, making sure you're checking forward or anterior stability of the chair as well before they go out the door. So for those newer therapists, like you were pointing out, Sarah, just two is a rough number. It means nothing to me, quite honestly, but I know people do that. But really, I want to see the person move around in it and see what happens with their mobility in their body to make sure they can manage it and they're stable. And so that's what I'll usually do as well once we adjust this in the clinic.
Another point of reference to Sarah is the aftermarket back world, where that contact point is, the back angle. That's all related to that. So you lose seat depth with certain backs. How do you get that back? So really understanding it's not always measuring the tie light way, but really understanding, where that contact point is in relationship to the center of that wheel. It's very critical.
That's great. So Josh, you recently shared the phrase occupied frame length. Can you explain what that is and what value it brings to the world of ultralights? And we've got a slide to show.
Yeah, so occupied frame length or frame length, you'll hear it described in different terms, has actually been around for a while. And really what it is, just boiling a basic element, it's where do you position the rider's butt and where do you position the rider's feet? And occupied frame length is something that we've been doing. We've just been doing it in a different way. We call it, or we combine our seat depth, our extra frame length, a front frame angle, things like that. And we have this overall measurement, which is where is that person positioned within the chair, and that's the occupied frame length. The reason I really like this, and the reason I think you're seeing a lot of manufacturers gravitate towards this, is because you're able to fine-tune that position a little bit more, and you're talking about it in a more precise way. So where we position that, and what that measurement actually is, just before I go any further, is you would measure from the front of the backrest tubes to the furthest point forward on the chair. And I said it like that. Usually it's your footrest. It's where that person is positioned in the chair. And it affects a lot of different things. So, for example, it affects your center of mass in the chair. It affects your center of gravity. All of those things that we talked about earlier, because you're changing as you change that occupied frame length, the center of mass of the individual in the chair. And it's really a critical measurement, and we've been doing this for a while, but what we typically do is we take that seat length and then an added frame length and then a front frame angle. And what we're able to do now, because of made-to-measure chairs, is actually fine-tune that a little bit more and say, we want the person to be positioned here, their butt to be here, and their feet to be here. And that doesn't necessarily equate to an 80-degree front frame angle or an 85 or whatever. So we get away from trying to figure out where their feet are going to be by determining a front frame angle, and just instead of saying, we want their butt here and their feet here. And this also becomes really important when you're talking about an adjustable chair. And it becomes really important with an adjustable chair because as you change your rear seat height, you change your front frame angle, right? So it's not so necessary. We don't get fixated on, we need an 80-degree front frame angle. And then you get the person in the chair and you lower their rear seat height, and now you don't have an 80-degree front frame angle. You have a 77-degree front frame, which is totally fine, right? All we want to do is we want to position their butt in the right position so that they're pelvically stable. That's first and foremost. And then position their feet. Maybe we're trying to break up spasticity. Maybe we're trying to increase balance. Maybe we're trying to give them a spot because they like to transfer with their feet on the floor, so they like to have their feet in front of their footrest. There's 100 different reasons for it, right? But ultimately what we want to do is make sure that they're comfortable while they're riding around the chair and they're able to perform their daily routine without problems. So occupied frame length allows us to position the individual a little bit more precisely. And we can do that by, calling out that specific measurement, and then do a couple different things around that. It helps us with, it's not necessarily changing our seat depth, but it helps us to understand what we're going to do, right? So it changes the way we're looking at those measurements. Maybe we're increasing the frame length up top beyond the seat depth, so that individual has a little bit more space to sit when they're transferring. And then therefore we're making a tighter front frame angle than even 85. Or maybe vice versa, So it gives us a little bit more freedom to then go back and manipulate some of those other numbers that we want as well. Making a little bit more additional frame length up top, tightening the front frame angle, opening the front frame angle, things like that. And it allows us to do it in such a way where we're precisely positioning the feet and the butt.
Everybody's
Does that
nodding
make
their
sense?
heads? Okay.
So I think it's something we've all done before. It's just a term that, and again, like I said, it can be called occupied frame length or frame length. But a lot of the manufacturers are referring to this so that we can do that type of fine tuning to the chair.
Hey, Josh, I'd like to add a couple key points to that as well. So when you're determining that, building that chair proportionally to the body, one great way is to really measure the chair that they're in, and you can really find where those points of references need to be. And it controls the wheelbase, which is vital. That's your fingerprint. You're reducing rolling resistance. That wheelbase is critical. Knowing your manufacturer and how they do that is even more critical. Sometimes we'll say a +1, a +1.5, a +2. And what we're doing is we're actually taking that front wheel and moving it forward to offload. So look at the manufacturer and how you can control that wheelbase, and then occupied frame length is really going to create where your feet are going to land, and that's real critical. And then where your butt's going to land, as Josh said. But those are really critical keys. It's something we've been doing for 30 years in the sports world. When we do sports wheelchairs, that was always the first measurement we take. So I would encourage you to use like a worksheet or use something that would measure when your clients come in, measure that measurement. So you know you have a reference point as when you're measuring their new product, what that measurement is. You know, if it's 24 inches, 25 inches, it's a really good measurement to have in your database just to understand proportional fit to that frame.
So Sarah, last but not least, last month, when I talked about basics of rigid wheelchairs, I stated at the very end, and I know not to give opinions, but I did, and I said that most active people using rigid wheelchairs have camber on their chairs. And I received calls, texts, emails from peers across the industry, whether they were in manufacturing, therapists, reps, suppliers, and they're like, get with the millennium. I don't always do camber on my chairs. So as a younger seating therapist, and you're closer to the new millennium than I am, what's your experience with camber?
So, you know, it's interesting because for me, if I don't like generalizations, but if you were generalizing, I would say I've seen more camber on pediatric chairs for the purpose of, you know, wheel access and different things of that nature. So looking at it providing wheel access, more stability, maneuverability, those types of things. I definitely see it in the sports wheel when I'm coaching wheelchair rugby. There's a lot of camber in those chairs. But typically, you know, scripting an everyday chair for a rider, camber to me has not been as common, only because I look for stability more so in my seat slope. So I'm a little bit more aggressive in how I position somebody for wheel access towards their back wheel, as well as center of gravity to attain the balance that I think people are looking for in terms of camber. And then just in terms of thinking about camber, as far as per degree per side of the chair, I think camber adds about 1/8 of an inch to an individual. So some manufacturers go 0.246. Other manufacturers are 0.35. So if we talk about adding that maximum 6 inches of camber to a chair with that 1/8 of an inch per degree per side, we're looking at potentially increasing the width of a chair 1.5 inches. So a lot of the conversations we're having in clinic are, you know, what size is the chair to start? And then also, what are we looking to accomplish? You know, what are the access considerations, whether it be household doorways or more active users. So the riders that I work with on the sports end are always trying to travel and get into airplanes and bathrooms and all of those things. So just being very hesitant to add any type of width to that frame. All that said, I will admit that Josh and Jim are taking me to school recently. So Josh offers a very good input and argument as to maybe why, you know, we talk about just a single degree of camber, which Josh can allude to, but I definitely like the argument and I'm willing to consider that for sure.
Thanks, Sarah. Josh, Jim, Mary, Cindy.
You know, it's so funny hearing this thought that most people don't do camber. I don't think I could tell you, I could almost count on two hands how many ultralight chairs I've done without camber. All of them, pretty much. Most of them, 90% of them, I would say, have camber, if I had to say a general rule of thumb. And usually it's that little 2-4 degrees. And why? Because if you look at our shoulders, we're not a box. Our shoulders just don't go straight down. The glenohumeral joint's on an angle. So if you have that little bit of camber to the chair, it matches the glenohumeral joint and the body mechanics of the shoulder joint that little bit better. And I always say, like, the dream would be if you could have 4 degrees. But to Sarah's point, it's all about access. And it's how many inches can we add, because it adds up quickly. And so the only time we don't do any camber for an ultra lightweight chair would be like doorways and what's the width of the person. Because sometimes, you know, as a nation, we've gotten a little bigger. And then because of that may be why you're seeing less with the camber. Because I'm like, wow, you know that I mean, that's not the rule of thumb. We want out there that you don't do any camber. You want a minimum 2 to 4 if the environment can tolerate it, because you want people and they want to. I mean, the whole thing is to access and get everywhere they need to. And we're not there in terms of wide doorways, et cetera, yet. But we also have to be mindful of the glenohumeral joint and making sure that we're in line there. And, you know, that little bit of camber gives a lot of lateral stability. So reaching side to side, people aren't just reaching in front to back. I mean, we don't do anything so evenly. We're reaching on angles. I mean, just who we are. And when you're in a chair and you're trying to get something, you'll reach from any way you can to get it. So that lateral stability you get from maybe that little bit of 2, 3, or 4 degree of camber would be huge. I think is huge.
Josh.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Josh.
No, go ahead, Jim. I think you're going to say the same thing.
Yeah, the functionality, I agree with the panel. Camber is definitely needed. But the functionality, understanding the functionality, I should say, of what camber is doing on a product. When we add camber to a chair, there's other things that come into factor, and it's the toe in and toe out aspect, understanding how to level those wheels out, because when it comes from a manufacturer, it doesn't mean that those wheels are square. So the rolling resistance that happens with a toe in product or even a toe out product is substantial and very damaging. So really understanding that. I put camber in my chair. It's a smaller degree because I'm a pretty big guy. As Josh would say, I'm probably too large here. But fitting in a hotel room or fitting in areas in a bathroom stall are critical. But the dynamics of a wheel, when a wheel is straight up and down, it just doesn't roll as well. And being able to put that angle on there, even if it's 1 degree, I know we offer 1 degree, but 1 and 2 degrees are very common for a lot of active people. But when you want to create stability and have that alignment of the shoulders, more camber is definitely desirable. But really understand the yings and the offsets of what will happen with camber if you add it. If you fluctuate your rear seat height and front seat height, you know, if I raise the front up, my wheels are going to toe out. If I raise the front down, my wheels are going to toe in. Same with the rear. So being able to understand how to adjust that and do that, it's really, really critical.
I think it's also important to mention, you know, wheel spacing as well. So if you want to add some level of camber, you know, what can you accomplish with your wheel spacing so that we're talking about potentially not making the footprint of the chair any wider than it needs to be. I know usually average or typical out of the factory is about 1 inch, but that might be a lot, like Mary said, for somebody's shoulder width compared to their hips, that we're really outsetting those wheels for them at a disadvantage, really, to begin, whereas that's something we can easily adjust upon delivery of a chair or whatever that is.
Well, and I would add on that is that, again, some of the manufacturing practices that we're invoking now allow us to actually make that rear wheel spacing even tighter, because we're tightening up the tolerances on those axle sleeves. And the problem was before is that if you had an axle sleeve with even just a minute amount of a tolerance or gap in there, that the rear wheel would flex in and out. And so it would scrub against the side guard of the chair. By tightening up the axle sleeve, we're able to move the rear wheels in a little bit closer. And to Mary's point, and Jim touched on it, you know, just a minor amount of camber in the wheel sets the wheel in a constant position. So the wheel itself is not fighting it on the chair, wanting to go left and go right. So 1 degree of camber makes a huge difference in terms of just getting that wheel into a constant position. And that's beneficial. You know, I've always put a little bit of camber in my chair. I think, honestly, the reason a lot of people went with 0 degrees of camber is if you look at like the you know, Paralympic athletes, those guys don't use any camber because they're traveling around all over the place. Get access into you know, facilities is important. You know, Jim can speak to this firsthand as a Paralympic athlete. And so a lot of times other riders look to those guys because that's just a cool factor of the chair. And what I like about 1 degree of camber is that you get that really narrow access, but you get a lot more performance in the chair. I don't notice much of a difference between 1 degree and 4 degrees, so except for the width. So a 1 degree camber is really a nice option because you're putting that wheel in a constant position. You're getting the optimal propulsion. You're getting the best turning out of the chair. It seems to be optimal in every way, and you're getting that stability as well.
Okay, thank you, all of you. Thanks for taking a chance. Thanks for coming out. I know a lot of it was, your experience and then opinions. And Marquette, if you could share with us some of the questions that are coming up, that would be great, because we do have time for questions now.
Yeah, certainly. Question about the Ergo Seating. Do all manufacturers offer Ergo Seating, and how do you determine if Ergo Seating is ideal for a user? And to clarify, sort of how deep is the usual flat portion of Ergo Seating? Is that standard? And how can we test this if we don't have any Ergo Seating chairs?
It's a great question. And no, not all manufacturers don't offer Ergo Seating. If you think of seating in general, and the clinicians could probably talk a heck of a lot better than I can, you're looking at that well, if you kind of generalize that. So a lot of people can do that in the seating aspects of it and create that same position. But what we find, and I can talk on the sports side of it, back in the old days, we used to call it an anti-thrust seat, and we utilize that to really lock in that pelvis so you don't get a lot of movement and you're kind of driving into that. I know some of the seating clinicians are probably cringing right now, but that's what an athlete would do to create more performance-oriented chair. But anytime you sit on an angle, you're going to encourage posterior pelvic tilt. So if you have severe slope, I would encourage you to use an ergo seat to drop somebody deeper into the chair to get a lower center of mass or better wheel access by 1/2 inch. So you have full contact when you use ergo. But if you're using seating, it's okay to go with a pretty flat seat in essence, but use the seating, but use the design of that cushion that you're using to incorporate into the design, meaning that if you're doing a front seat height of 19 inches and you put on a lack of knowing a better company, but Ride Designs, which is a fabulous cushion, that 4 inches up in front, you're really raising somebody up. So I know I'm using extremes here, but you need to build that into the design of the chair and use that cushion for the stability and balance. And then to answer the next, I used to think 6 and 7 inches of flat seat what was appropriate. I've learned recently and just by experience that 4 inches is really common in an area that you're really going after. And some guys, even in the basketball world, go with less, but they sit pretty flat. So what you're trying to do, particularly if you're sitting on a flat cushion, is really trying to create the forces to stop somebody from sliding out or holding them into that chair.
I think the
only thing I would add really quickly is that with an ergo seat, if you're doing one for a client, is remember you're sitting at the lowest point. Typically with a linear seat slope, you're not. So that's one of the things you want to consider. One of the things I also add is that I use an ergo seat in my chair, and it allows me to have less seat slope. So coming up out of that hole, like Cindy talked about earlier, is easier.
right.
Cindy, I know you do ergos. What is your...
We do ergos quite a bit, especially with people who need a lot of seat slope. but have difficulty climbing out of that seat slope. But I think the big thing that the Ergo does when you're really looking at it from a positioning standpoint is when you have a lot of seat slope, it rolls the pelvis back into posterior rotation. And because it puts that angle on the ischials, right? So it creates that angle that the ischials want. Everything wants to continue rolling back. And when you flatten out that seat slope in the or not the slope, but that back part of the seat, it allows the ischials to roll back forward and puts your pelvis in a more neutral position. So again, it's a really good thing for somebody who tends to slide out of the chair but has posterior rotation, but it's not very good for somebody who has anterior rotation because they roll into that even more.
I think go, Mary.
Sorry, I know we're out of time, but I just want to say, I find too, for some women who are pear-shaped or men or whoever is a little more pear-shaped, if they have more tissue down there, sometimes it'll accommodate it better than having no Ergo seat. So I've also found a benefit with that. Sorry, Sarah.
No worries. I was saying, I think the biggest take home for me has always, I work with athletes who love Ergo. Their rugby chairs have Ergo, their everyday chairs have Ergo, and then I work at a seating clinic, which we don't always use Ergo. So for me as a younger clinician to just make apples and oranges of it, right? Recognizing what your cushion is meant to accomplish and what you're trying to accomplish with that seating system. So being more, I don't want to say intelligent, but, really knowing why you're prescribing a particular seat cushion, and what you're trying to achieve with the makeup of that cushion. So like Jim said, the Ride obviously offers quite a lot of pelvic stability and offloading. That's not necessarily something you would put in an Ergo seat because the design doesn't allow for that flexibility to accommodate that. So just being really specific and deliberate about how we're prescribing things, I think is super important because Ergo is definitely the way this industry started with the sports chairs and looks like where it's going, but making sure people know, the differences and the whys and the why nots in certain situations.
I think a couple of things too is if you want to know whether the Ergo is going to work with somebody, use a wedge under the front of their cushion in their own chair and see what it does to them. But the point to Jim and the 4 inches and how long does that flat piece need to be? Some people have a lot of redundant tissue in the rear. Mm-hmm. And if you do 4 inches, their ischials may be hitting that front of that. So you really need to also pay attention to where the ischials are actually falling in the seat.
That's great.
We can answer a few more questions. We know we're done, and obviously a lot of you have to go see patients or do whatever you need to do. But if there are questions, we can answer them. If there, Marquette, how many more questions are there?
Yeah, just a few more. Is there an easy way to add camber to a non-cambered Quickie 2?
Yes. You can just put in some, they will, you often do it with spacers in the axle plate there. And so you put more spacers on the bottom and you can call Quickie and just Sunrise and ask them specifically, can you send me some spacers, etc. And you just put, depending on what you want, you may want to start with 1 or 2 spacers on the bottom of the axle plate to try a little bit of camber. But remember, a little does a lot. So the little spacer will thin, but it'll tilt that plate, and you want to be careful how much. So don't be so aggressive when you're first doing it.
Cool. One more question here. After being a para for 46 years, I've had to have my legs amputated due to circulation issues. I'm really trying hard to find balance. Can you give me suggestions? I use a Quickie chair and I've added the plates that move the wheels back. Sadly, it's too far back. Any suggestions?
Jim's thinking real hard.
So go ahead, Mary. You probably have.
If it's too far back with the amputee axle plate, which is what they added to it, what I do is start with the axle in the rearward position. And then just watch where the seat, the back support is and the back angle. And maybe you need to tweak that a little bit if the wheels are too far back when you're in that with that amputee axle plate. So
And,
it
and
starts
here's an opportunity to put anti-tippers like you talked about, Mary, back on the chair or just till you get used to it so you feel safe, right?
Right.
Get the rear wheel in the right position. Maybe it's also back angle too. I mean, my first suggestion would be get to a seating clinic and tell them your problem and see, you know, what kind of solutions they can come up with. Because without seeing anything, you know, we could sit here and guess all day long, but there's got to be a better solution than an amputee axle plate. I know that every manufacturer carries them because it's almost a reimbursement requirement, but I've never seen them where they've been any good to any of the riders.
Yeah.
I
Lower
would,
center mass.
yeah, I would look at just common sense physics, you know, lowering, as Sarah just said, lowering yourself. And I know as being a para and then now a double amputee, transferring is critical. So, but a half an inch makes a huge difference. If I can lower you down into that chair, I'm going to create more stability. Trying to get that wheel as far forward as you can by what Josh says, but really offloading, sometimes you want to put more forces on the front of the chair or vice versa. Really understanding weight distribution for where your weight is, that is critical. And the only way to do that is really go to a seating clinic and experiment with some stuff. You know, call in, you know, we're manufacturers. I mean, the clinical people come across this all the time. We can help with some solutions or say, this is why the chair is reacting this way, but have you tried this? And we can kind of help that process in a team approach. And I think that's really the way that you can create balance. But that's a tough one. That's a tough question.
Thank you. This was a phenomenal opportunity. I really want to thank all of you on our panel. Sarah, for taking a chance. You know, it's lovely to have you as part of my team. And I really thank you for getting on the panel. Cindy and Mary, thanks for sharing your experiences. You're the geniuses of the seating world, and I really appreciate you being on our panel. Josh and Jim are our geniuses at Sunrise, and Sarah and I have been spending a lot of time with them, learning so much about their ideas on any type of manual chair and how to position the person to make it best for them. And you know, I've been in this profession for 40 years, and I got to tell you, this last week I was swimming in information. And so, you know, it's fun because I think that's why we all stay in the profession, because it keeps changing and we keep learning. And, you know, what was old might come back new again, but what's new is still exciting. And thank you all for joining us today and being part of this great group.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
opportunity. Have a great day.
Nice to meet y'all too. Take care.